Roberta Gilbert, in her small book, The Eight Concepts, writes, "If you know theory, you can use it. If you don't, you can't." She then writes that when faced with relationship difficulties, she runs down the list of the 8 concepts to see which applies and how. By the time she is finished, she has several directions to find her way out of her difficulty. Bowen theory is based on an understanding of the family as a whole, as an emotional unit. Whatever affects one in the system affects each one in the system. Anxiety moves easily from person to person, like a flock of birds taking flight or a herd of cattle bolting out of fear. Robert Gilbert writes that to think systems, the brain has to be retrained. Of the 8 concepts, differentiation of self is the place to begin. However, before we begin differentiation of self, let's consider the nature of systems and the amazing connections between people, all species, and even this amazing planet and the universe in which we live. This is very much a component of what it means to live in an intercultural, multicultural, global world. Bowen's concept of differentiation of self is the most misunderstood of the 8 concepts in the theory, probably also the most important. Michael Kerr, who's a well-known Bowen theorist, he's retired clinical director and professor at Georgetown, who worked closely with Murray Bowen, writes in Family Evaluation that family systems theory is based on the assumption that the human is a product of evolution and that human behavior is significantly regulated by the same natural processes that regulate the behavior of all other living beings. And this chart just gives you a visual of the connection throughout time of all species. And then Dr. Suzanne Simard is an ecologist who studies forests and the effort to support healthy forests as part of an ecosystem that can impact climate change by reducing and storing carbon. Trees work with the environment under the ground and above the ground in a network of tree roots, fungi, mycelium, and a complex communication system between trees and other plants in the forest. The communication between trees and the rest of the environment is not easy to see until one learns to recognize how communication takes place. Human families operate in a similar complex communication system that can be difficult to notice until one develops the ability to see the emotional process at play. And Bowen theory offers some key concepts to help one develop the capacity to observe the emotional processes that are operating in a family system, in an individual, in a community, in an organization, and in the society at large. And these 8 concepts are the nuclear emotional family system, which means just a single generation of parents and children, differentiation of self and the scale for differentiation of self, triangles, which is how people tend to be. It's a natural process where 2 people will immediately bring a 3rd person in to be part of their relationship. Cutoff, which is a way in which we deal with our anxiety, the family emotional process, multi-generational transmission process, sibling position, emotional process in society, and also a 9th one that Murray Bowen was working on, which is about spirituality. Murray Bowen's research was the basis for concluding that the human family is a naturally occurring system. As a system, the interactions of family members add up to a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. This is also true for the way organizations function and the way societies function, that the interactions of individual members add up to a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. This system of interactions is reciprocal, which means it happens automatically back and forth between people and includes the individuals to the whole family and the whole family to the individuals, or individuals to the organization or society. Bowen theory departs from pathology and cause and effect thinking that are the core of principles of traditional psychotherapy. Bowen theory thinks systems and not diagnosing and pathology. So what are our emotions? I like to use this little video clip from Lisa Feldman Barrett to talk about how emotions are made.
To make an emotion, you need core brain networks to do a couple of things. First, your brain has to represent all the stuff going on inside your body. Your heart beating, your lungs filling and emptying, your stomach digesting food, your hormones rushing through your bloodstream, and the workings of your immune system. This activity produces a spectrum of basic feeling from pleasant to unpleasant and from calm to jittery. Even neutral stems from these physical changes. Second, your brain has to remember your past experiences. Here's a way to think about it. Your brain spends all of its time locked in a dark, silent box called your skull. Its only clues about what's going on in the world around you come from scraps of information from your senses: sights, sounds, smells, touches, and tastes. Your brain has to figure out what these scraps mean so it knows how to keep you alive and well. Do you need to run? Do you need to laugh? And so on. Its only tool for answering this question is your past experience. So your brain has access to the sensory effects without actually knowing what the causes are. It has to guess at what the causes are. What did similar scraps of information mean the last time you were in a similar situation? Your brain is taking guesses using your past experience, and it uses the momentary information from the outside world to either confirm those guesses or to modify them. The same process for deciphering the outside world also works for figuring out what's going on inside your body. If you have a dull ache in your stomach, does it mean that you're hungry, that you're sick, that you're angry, that you're missing someone? Again, your brain is using past experience to guess what caused this situation. So you have an emotion when your brain uses past experience to give your sensations meaning as an emotion. Maybe the last time your stomach ached like this, in a similar situation, you were angry. Maybe you clenched your fists and started to breathe deeply. Your brain may guess that your current stomach ache has a similar cause, anger, and needs a similar action. Likewise, when you see emotions in other people, it's because your brain uses past experience to give emotional meaning to their smiles and frowns and laughs and hand gestures and body postures and so on. Sometimes a scowl means anger, but other times the same scowl means that someone is concentrating really hard.
So emotions are automatic physiological reactions such as the increased heart rate, changes in blood pressure and breathing, and hormonal changes. Emotions do not just reside in the brain, but also the body, and are an interaction, a communication between brain and body. Feelings are emotions, physiological changes that one is conscious and aware of. However, the influence of feelings often happens outside of our awareness. Life experience over time provides insight and meaning to feelings. A little cartoon. I'll only give you the paper if you promise not to let the news upset you. A lot of our emotional responses have to do with our entire lived history. Emotion awareness includes being able to choose how we respond. So I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah. I'm the descendant of the first generation of Mormon pioneers who traveled from Nauvoo, Illinois, across the plains and mountains looking for a safe place to reside and practice their faith. Some of my ancestors converted to LDS while still in Scotland and immigrated to Utah in the mid-1800s. My ancestors settled in northern Utah and southern Idaho. My family of origin, so my parents, my siblings, and I, left Utah when I was 9. Lived in Idaho, Wisconsin, Texas before settling in Illinois, where I lived for 40 years. I was a dance major in college and worked as a technical director for dance at a modern dance theater in Chicago in the early 1800s. 4 years later, tired of the arduous life of a struggling artist, I left the theater world, spent a year working at Eddie Bauer on Wabash, selling hiking boots, and there I met my husband. I left Eddie Bauer and went to work for a well-known interior designer in Chicago and spent 4 years working with some of the wealthiest families in the city. But after my daughter was born, I quit work and stayed home with her. When she was 3, I went back to school to train as a massage therapist. Our son was born at the end of that training. I spent a number of years working very part-time as a massage therapist, including some volunteer work at what was then Lutheran General Hospital, offering massages to parents of sick children. That was a turning point for me because I experienced parents under extreme duress, people who would often tell me about their worries and for whom I felt like I couldn't offer enough. I decided to return to school in order to learn how to help people emotionally and spiritually, but I wasn't sure if I should be a hospital chaplain or a hospital social worker. I explored a number of different master's degree programs and stumbled upon a dual degree program at Loyola's Graduate School of Social Work. The dual degree was with local seminaries, and in 4 years I could earn a Master's of Divinity and a Master's of Social Work, and along the way figure out if I wanted to be a chaplain or a social worker. I was particularly captivated by Loyola offering an MSW, a Master's of Social Work, that was on a clinical track with an emphasis in family systems. It seemed to me that was just what I needed if I planned to work for families. In the end, I became a parish priest, and the parish ministry has kept me in the midst of family emotional processes for the last 25 years, and the dual degree has served me well. It's also kept me right in the midst of cultural changes across this country as churches have started to enter into steep decline, and churches have tried to navigate what it means to live a life of meaning and purpose in these very changing times. My training in Bowen theory was slim when I graduated from Loyola, not nearly enough for me to have a good handle on theory. In the first 9 years or so, I employed it pretty unevenly and more like a strategy for change, as if the goal was to change other people, but really the goal was to work on oneself. It took me a while to figure that out, and to figure out that the best work I could do was to work on my own family of origin and my own nuclear family, and then apply what I was learning to how I was functioning in the relationship systems in the congregation. Differentiation of self for me required learning how to observe myself inside out, as well as observing my emotion, how my family functioned and how I functioned in my family, and then how that learning carried over into the way I was behaving and functioning in my marriage and my parenting and in my professional life. Understanding myself began with me developing the ability to notice what was going on inside of me, what I literally felt in my body, from areas that were tight with tension to the thoughts that were rumbling around in my head, shaping the meaning I was making out of events. 4 things have helped me deepen my awareness and gain clarity into my thoughts and actions, moving me from automatic behavior to more thoughtful awareness and consideration before speaking or acting. And these are critical skills for navigating intercultural relationships because of the tension that one can experience when you are navigating differences between oneself and others. And these 4 things that I have practiced in my life have been meditation, Bowen theory, the intercultural development inventory, and then trying to figure out who I was as a parish priest, working with scripture every Sunday, sorting out what I think and believe as I try and teach also to the congregation, has been a really critical skill for me to define myself within the work that I do. Over time, I learned how to make an effort to define self when preaching and working with the congregation and in my own family. I learned transcendental meditation when I was 19, and I've practiced it most of my life, though the first decade of raising children made it difficult to find time to meditate regularly. Meditation helped me notice what was going on inside my body, where areas of tension were, and the long ramblings of my thoughts. But it wasn't until I began to apply Bowen theory to myself and my understanding of self that I found ways to start making sense of what was going on inside and making sense of the rumblings inside of my head, and to be able to navigate things more consciously and with ways that I chose instead of just automatically responding to situations. Differentiation of self has nothing to do with emotional health, illness, or pathology. The scale has no correlation to social, economic level, or intelligence. The family togetherness forces pull families together, and Bowen calls this fusion. It begins with a marriage between a couple and then includes children and other family members. There's a counterbalancing force in response to the togetherness fusion that pulls one towards being an individual. So there's a togetherness piece and the individual piece. Sometimes this is called the emotional mature part of an individual. A person can be in a relationship with others without needing others to affirm who one is, nor validate what one thinks, and to be comfortable with one's own values, beliefs, and personhood, and without the need to change other people to have them try and be more like you. I am me, and you are you. And we can be comfortable in a relationship in which we can appreciate what we have in common and our differences, a really key skill for intercultural relationships. So the most important variable that affects a person's level of emotional functioning is the interplay between the intellectual and the emotional systems. The capacity to maintain a self in relationships is a very powerful anxiety reducer. So finding ways for me to be comfortable being me and you to be comfortable being you. The effect derives from the interplay between the intellectual system and the emotional feeling system. This is from Bowen, Michael Kerr's book, Bowen Theory Secrets, page 47. Human families operate in similar, complex communication systems that can be difficult to notice until one develops the ability to see the emotional process at play. Bowen theory provides some key concepts to help one develop the capacity to observe the emotional processes that are operating in the family and in the individual. Murray Bowen's research was the basis for concluding that the human family is a naturally occurring system. The interactions of family members add up to a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. In considering the interactions, one observes the individuals to the whole family and the whole family to the individuals, as well as to an organization and to society. And so there's some characteristics of the togetherness and individuality force. Bowen writes that a critical index of the functioning of an emotional system is the balance of the togetherness individual forces. These two operate as a team, largely out of sight and outside of our conscious awareness. Any emotional system has an amount of togetherness forces and a reciprocal amount of individuality forces which constitute a norm for that family or group or society. An optimum, Bowen would say, is about a 50-50 balance, but of course that rarely ever happens. But that would be this really even balance and the capacity to change and adapt easily. As anxiety in a system rises, the pull toward togetherness increases. People want to be more together when they get anxious in an effort to relieve the anxiety in the system, and it works for a length of time. These forces are sensitive in a sensitive balance. Eventually, though, there will be a counterbalance pull toward individuality as people need to start to define themselves in the mix of the tension of a large togetherness group. Systems manage these forces more or less adaptively. Regression and other symptoms may arise as a maladaptive response to these forces, and regression is really a sign of acting in a more immature way, with more automatic way, a more anxious way. Stresses occur, they're naturally occurring, anxiety rises, and in response to conflict happens, distancing happens, cutoff happens, or a projection process may occur as people manage the automatic emotional processes in their family system. This process can be observed across multiple generations in the family organizations, which is why Bowen theory uses a genogram, so we have a visual, an actual diagram of how the family has functioned across the generations where there's been symptoms of disease or anxiety or death or divorce or other sorts of symptoms. You can see them in a picture, and it helps to give you an idea of how it's moving through the family system. This also works in organizations and in society even. If a person in a system can define self, take a clearly defined position, the anxiety in the system may eventually calm down, though some initial reactivity may take place. And so the togetherness forces are derived from a universal need for love. We want to be loved and approved, and we like the emotional closeness. The individuality forces derive from a need to be productive, autonomous individual, and it's defined by self rather than the dictates of the group. And the two forces exactly balance each other. So Bowen theory conceptualizes the reciprocal emotional interdependence of members of the family. People are expressing and being regulated by emotions that flow through the entire system in observable ways. I was talking about that genogram. That helps give a diagram of how it happens. Interdependent functioning is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how species and human beings function. We function interdependently. There are observable patterns of interdependent functioning that are influenced by feeling states within and between individuals, psychological states, and culture. Very important when we are working through intercultural relationships to be attentive to what is going on in all of these dimensions, and that takes time and practice to learn how to do that. These observable patterns include the degree to which a person is differentiated and functions as an individual, and also the degree in which the person aligns with the family, group, or society pressures to think and act alike, which is the togetherness pattern. Individual and together. So the pull towards togetherness is a really strong force. Differentiation of self is a very key concept in Bowen theory. I think it's a key concept in intercultural relationships because it's really about me learning how to be comfortable with myself while also being comfortable with you being you. So learning to understand Bowen's concept of differentiation of self can be complicated. Bowen saw the self in observable patterns or levels of development that he called basic self, solid self, pseudo-self, and functional self. And we're not going to really go through most of those, but they're just different ways in which a person really navigates what it means to be a self. So it begins by developing an understanding of the theory as a whole, particularly the family emotional unit. We learn how to define ourselves within our relationship systems. We develop a capacity to maintain a self within the relationship system. It's an interplay, as I said, between the intellectual and the emotional system, and they're completely intertwined. Feelings are a person's subjective experience of the activity of the emotional system. So our feelings are our subjective experience of what's going on in the emotional system. That emotional system is outside our conscious awareness, becomes conscious when we define it as a feeling. Visualize yourself not falling off the wall. So again, in Bowen theory, there's basic self, solid self, and pseudo-self. And we're not going to go through very much of that except to say that there are different ways in which Bowen theory begins to define a really solid sense of self. Sometimes we develop a sense of self that is influenced by our culture and isn't really deeply embedded in who we are as an individual. So as a basic self, these are things that are learned from childhood experiences. This is the self that's formed by the time people are in late adolescence. The basic self is generally thought to be fixed for life, though it can be changed to a small degree with intentional effort by applying theory to one's relationship. Solid self is the self that really starts to take I positions. It's grounded in a real solid sense of who one is. It's a good balance. You have a good balance between the emotional and the intellectual functioning. And you tend to make decisions based on I positions. You can speak about yourself. It's made up of firmly held beliefs and values that are developed slowly over time and are not changed by coercion, but they can be changed by deep thinking and reflection on what one actually values and believes. And people higher on the scale of differentiation have a more solid sense of self that helps them make adaptive decisions about matters that can carry out even on a high level of emotional balance. So even when you're highly anxious, you can still make good decisions when you're functioning from your solid self. And then there's pseudo-self, which is a self that gets adapted from our relationship systems. It's the way in which you might function in our job position. It might not be exactly who we are, but we function in that position because that's the job that we have, for example. A well-differentiated person operates with a good balance between intellectual and emotional functioning, with the two as a team, as I've said. And then some of the steps to take over time to increase one's differentiation of self. So increase one-to-one contact with one's family, work toward a person-to-person relationship with every family member, expand contact beyond parents in the family system, observe reactivity in yourself and in the system, recognize and contain one's own anxious reactions, develop a factual history of the family, be present at times when anxiety and intensity are higher and visible, such as weddings, funerals, hospitalizations, other such occasions, become more objective about self and others, increase responsibility for yourself, define one's beliefs and principles for living. What do I think? What do I believe? What do I value? What are clear to me? Represent oneself and one's best thinking in relationship to other family members. This is from Victoria Harrison's Family Diagram and Family Research. Emotions are the wisdom of the ages. So out of the rich concepts of Bowen theory come a whole host of ways to work on gaining more of a self, a basic self, and living less out of the pseudo-self. Primary among these is, of course, going back to one's family and working on self there. The most effective way to change relationship or personality difficulties is in the system where they were first developed. It's from Roberta Gilbert's 8 Concepts.